What if robots could detect disease in food crops before it's too late? What if drones and robots could team up to prevent forest wildfires? What if AI-powered computer simulations called digital twins could improve operations across the agricultural life cycle? And what if a robot could do the farm work that no one wants to, like picking an apple? Hello, you're listening to Where What If Becomes What's Next from Carnegie Mellon University, where we ask the bold questions that become innovations for the betterment of humanity. I'm your host, Randy Scott, and in this episode, we're taking you back to the farm where we're continuing our exploration of how robotics and AI are helping agriculture address some of its biggest problems. As our global population approaches 10 billion by 2050, humanity faces an unprecedented challenge. How do we feed everyone while preserving our planet's finite resources? The answer may lie in the convergence of agriculture and cutting-edge robotics technology. Today's agricultural landscape is being transformed by autonomous machines that plant seeds with millimeter precision, drones that monitor crop health from above, and AI-powered systems that detect plant diseases before they're visible to the human eye. These innovations aren't just technological achievements. They're essential tools in our fight against food insecurity and climate change. The statistics are compelling. Automated farming systems can reduce pesticide use by up to 90%, while increasing yields by 20%. Robotic harvesters work around the clock, addressing severe labor shortages worldwide, while precision agriculture robots help farmers optimize water usage and minimize environmental impacts from fertilizers and pesticides. As extreme weather events become more frequent and arable land becomes scarcer, agricultural robotics represents more than progress. It embodies hope for a sustainable and resilient future. We're speaking with George Kantor, a research professor in the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, whose 2 decades of pioneering research in agricultural robotics has helped shape this revolutionary field. We previously spoke with Professor Kantor a year ago for Season 1 of our podcast in the episode AI in Agriculture, How to Pick an Apple. And today, we're going to learn what's new about teaching a robot to harvest that apple, as well as other robot and AI innovations. Plus, Professor Kantor will take us inside a new robotic facility at CMU and introduce us to an innovative mentoring program he co-founded in Pittsburgh called Girls of Steel Robotics. George, catch us up. What's your assessment of the current state of agriculture and robotics?
People think of agriculture as a thing. In reality, I think it's about 10,000 different things, but let's say it's 2 different things, and we'll break it into 2 big categories. So there's, what I would call the agronomic crops, broadland agriculture. So this is your staple crops, corn, wheat, soybeans, rice. And then there are specialty crops, and these are pretty much everything else. Fresh vegetables, fresh fruits, nuts, berries, maple syrup, anything that is an agricultural product that's not one of those big staples.
Okay, so where are robotics and AI making the biggest impact?
The answers are very different for those 2 different types of crops. In the commodity crops, the big crops, there already is a very high degree of automation. The place where AI and robotics, more the AI than the robotics in that case, because they are so successful at automation already, can really help is by helping those producers produce basically what they're producing today at the same cost with a lower environmental footprint. So then there's the second category, which is the one that's much more interesting to me, which is the specialty crops. So these are usually smaller in volume, but higher in value. And they usually require much more manual involvement, human involvement, than the large scale crops do. And so, apples, there's mechanized machines that will pick apples, but they bruise the apples, and that's great for applesauce. But you're not going to buy a bruised apple off of the shelf in the grocery store. And an apple on the shelf in a grocery store is like 20 times more valuable than an apple that gets mushed up and put into applesauce. And that is a place where, especially at this particular moment, we rely on a huge amount of immigrant labor for those crops. A lot of those workers are going to be harder to get or be more expensive to get. And so I think robotics can help there. I really think that Robotics is one of the ways that we could potentially keep those industries in the United States and keep them competitive. If we don't do something in that area, we're just going to lose domestic production of those crops and we're going to import them from overseas, which is not a very good outcome either.
Last time we talked about the difficulty of getting a robot to carefully pick fruit like apples. Have there been any advancements since then in both the dexterity and the decision making about which fruit to pick?
I mean, this is an area it's evolving rapidly. The thing we've been focused on in the last year is this idea called learning from demonstration. The idea is to watch people do these tasks and have the robot learn how to imitate what the people do. And that is a very different approach from the old school approach where you make planning algorithms and you think the way a computer does and you try to move the robot to do its thing. We just watch people do the tasks and we try to mimic what they do. There are a couple of specific technologies that really make this feasible. This is cutting edge stuff. One is the ability of these large language models to analyze video and do things like tell where the human is and how they're holding their hand and whether or not they've got a tool, and if they've got a tool, what they're touching with it, and those kinds of things. So we can collect all these videos of people doing things. We can turn those videos into data that can then be used to inform what a robot might do.
Got it, but once the robot learns what to do from these videos, how does it learn to physically copy the right human movements?
There's a method we've been exploring with called diffusion policies that gives a computer a way to mimic the set of things that a person might do. If I have a task I want to accomplish, like pick an apple, and I take a picture of the scene and I ask 100 different people to pick that apple, they're going to do it 100 different ways. So there's what we call a distribution of trajectories that you might follow to pick that apple. And that distribution is very complicated. But what this diffusion policy idea does is it uses deep learning to transform that complicated distribution into a very simple distribution.
Okay, and that simple distribution basically teaches the robot the best way to pick an apple. Problem solved, right?
That's part of the problem for sure. But then there's also how do you get to the apple? I've got my hand outside the apple tree and I've got to reach my hand inside the apple tree and maybe reach around some things, maybe push something out of the way on the way in. There's two parts of that. One is the brain part, which is figuring out how I'm going to move. And should I go to the left or the right? Should I push this thing and look behind it, or should I just go straight at it? That's the decision making side. On the physical side, I mean, things continue to progress. The physical aspects of robotics evolve much more slowly than the computational aspects of it do. The AI decision making side of things is getting better very rapidly right now. We're in this incredible moment where you have the exponential growth of AI tools getting built and then people using those AI tools to do even things even faster.
Given the different timelines between computational advances and physical robotics development, how long before we see these harvesting robots actually working in commercial farms?
I mean, we see them today in research settings, and they've been in research settings for the past 20 years. They're getting better and better. There are a few examples of where they are actually rising to the level of being used in commercial settings. There's also a few failures where people got pretty far along the way and then the business case didn't quite support it. Right now, there's proof of concepts for all of the big things you would want to do: harvest apples, harvest grapes, harvest strawberries. Those are kind of the big three right now. Technologically, we know how to do this. The outstanding challenge to get you to the point where this is like a standard practice that gets used in the field is really a business side of things, right? Now that we can do it, we got to get it cheap enough that it makes sense, right? And we have to develop the models of using it in a business. Like, is it something where there's a company that owns the robots and leases them out to the farmers? Do the farmers own the robots? If the farmers own the robots, how do they keep them going? Are they robust enough, or do you need to have technicians come out? Do your operators need special trainings? Right? There's dozens of these kind of non-technical aspects that are currently barriers to getting these things out in the field. There's legal issues as well, right? So there's this whole set of other issues that come into it. I think if you look at the self-driving car industry and what's happened in that industry, it really kicked off in earnest over 15 years ago. The technical problems have been solved for a long time. And finally, just now, Waymo is putting taxis out in cities. And why did it take so long? There's all kinds of other issues that came up: legal issues, liability issues, business case issues, governmental issues, all those kinds of things. And so the same thing is going to be true with farm robotics.
Let's talk about your safe forest project for wildfire prevention. So, how are you using aerial and ground drones to help create safer forests and prevent the devastating wildfires that we're seeing around the world?
So the key idea of safe forest is that if you look at a forest or any kind of wild land, there are things that are likely to burn and things that are not likely to burn, or things that are likely to burn easily and things that are less likely to just kind of catch on fire if someone throws a cigarette out the window. Our forests are big black boxes. We don't really know where they're likely to catch on fire and where they're not. And so what we proposed in the Safe Forest was to use drones to map out forest lands and identify the vegetation that's likely to turn into fuel for a fire and the vegetation that's not. And the kind of vegetation we're worried about are things like, low kind of scrubby weeds and small bushes and things like that, that when there's dry conditions, those things dry out faster. They become tinder for bigger fires. And so at Carnegie Mellon, we developed this drone and a sensing payload for it that used LiDAR and regular camera RGB imagery and multispectral camera imagery to build a 3D map. So you fly the drone around the forest, you build a 3D map. You use those sensors I just mentioned to classify all the different parts. Here's a tree, here's a bush, here's a street, here's grass. Ultimately, we want to make this assessment of, is this fuel or is this not? So that was our part, was building that map. We had some partners at a company called Engineerius in Portugal who is developing a Bobcat-like platform that's autonomous. So you have a kind of small tracked construction vehicle kind of thing. Instead of having a bulldozer on the front, they have this big vegetation grinder. And so the idea is that once you know where all of the fuel is in an area, you can send this Bobcat in and have it clear out the parts that are going to be particularly dangerous. You can't do this everywhere in the world, but there are some places where it's more important than others. So, for example, under power line corridors, you might go through and clear out the dangerous vegetation that's there.
And you're using similar robotic technology to detect potentially devastating crop disease before farmers can even see it, right?
The specific project is a project that's working on detecting fire blight in apple orchards. So fire blight is a really devastating disease and also a really common disease in apple orchards. And it's the kind of thing that once it appears, you really have nothing you can do other than destroy the plant that has it. So if you see like a little tip on the end of a branch, you can cut that branch off. If it's spread down the branch and gotten close to the trunk, you just have to dig up the whole tree. If it's infected a whole tree, then you probably have to dig out a part of your row. The sooner you detect it, the better off you are as far as mitigating it. And so sort of like we did with the Safe Forest project, where we made this sensor payload to detect fuel versus non-fuel. We made a sensor payload using similar set of sensors, lasers, cameras, and multispectral cameras. And the idea is you put this thing on a robot or a utility vehicle, you drive it through the field, and it can automatically map and detect fire blight at an early stage. If you detect it early, then and you give the grower a map of where it's been detected early, it's relatively easy for him to mitigate it. Whereas if you don't have a robot actively looking for it, and you wait until it shows up in a very obvious way, then it becomes a very expensive thing to mitigate.
Are you doing something similar for tomatoes called the Tomato Gantry Project, using robots for early disease detection?
The trick is to detect the disease as early as you possibly can. And in certain settings, like if you're growing tomatoes in a greenhouse, there are some diseases that by the time you see them at all, it's too late and you have to wipe out your entire crop. because in those environments, I mean, there's these controlled greenhouse environments, everything's close together, the air is being circulated, it's hot and humid, ideal disease conditions. By the time you see it, probably every plant in the greenhouse is infected and you lose your entire crop. So what the Tomato Gantry Project worked on was detecting disease before you can even see it. And the way to do that was to take physical samples of the plants and analyze them genetically and look for not the genetics of the plant, but the genetics of any organisms that might be on the plant. So this allows us to detect the exposure to microbial pathogens before any visible symptom shows up on the plant. And so from a robotics side, it's kind of the same robotics problem we solve all the time, which is figure out where you want to go grab something, go and grab it. And we used this thing called a MEMS microneedle array, which was a little custom fabricated square about a centimeter on a side that had about 500 little tiny microscopic microneedles on there. And you go in and you just kind of pick a leaf and you squish the microneedle array against the leaf. And what happens is then all the juice from the leaf kind of gets sucked up in that array. And then we go over and drop the array off into a box. We have some collaborators at a Song Lee's lab at Virginia Tech, and they then would take that array and extract all of the biological material from it and then do the genomic stuff you do, which involves amplifying the genetics that are there and then sequencing them and trying to find pathogens from a database of pathogens.
Wow, can commercial tomato growers get their hands on this yet?
So the way this would probably first impact in the industry would be to have a person just go out there with a pair of scissors and snip a leaf off and stick it in one of the genetic sequencers. And then the grower has a new tool to more quickly identify these pathogens. What the robot adds is then the grower can do it without any extra labor input, can do it at scale, can do it more frequently, which makes it more likely to work and more likely that they catch something earlier.
Let's talk about one of the staple crops, corn, and a robotic technology you have been working on that could optimize fertilization by adding just the right amount of nitrogen to the crop. We talked a little bit about that in the last episode, so can you fill us in on where that project stands?
With our partners at Iowa State, they have developed a needle you insert in a corn stalk and it measures nitrogen. We made a robot do that insertion. Oh man, the idea is you can measure the actual nitrogen that the corn is taking up in the field, which is a very, very hard thing to measure, especially in real time. Like the standard way of doing it is to chop the plant down and dry it out and feed it through a machine that tells you what's there. So the idea is then you can use this with a robot to do it at scale. In real time, you can estimate how the plants are taking up nitrogen. And because it's real time, you still have the chance to go out and add more nitrogen if you need to.
Fertilizing is a bit of a tricky task. If the farmers do too little, their crops may suffer, but if they do too much, it gets really expensive, wasteful, and potentially damaging to the environment, right?
Yeah, exactly. The idea is to get exactly the right amount. Right now, farmers, they're not going to get it right because they don't have a way of measuring it. And if they're going to get it wrong, it's better for them to get it wrong by adding too much nitrogen rather than too little. And so we want to get them into a place where they can add what they think is exactly the right amount. And if it's too little, they'll be able to detect it early and fix it.
So what happens when too much nitrogen is applied to a crop? It can run off into the water system and create environmental impacts, right?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, that nitrogen gets in the water. All life likes to eat nitrogen. So it encourages algal blooms and all kinds of other issues that affect the ecosystem.
Finally, let's discuss the AI Institute for Resilient Agriculture and the digital twins you're developing. A digital twin is a virtual, real-time computer model that uses data to simulate behavior, monitor performance, and predict outcomes. It's a better model that can make agriculture perform better and be more resilient. How does this simulation model work?
We use the term digital twin instead of just saying a model. Digital twin is this word, it's a big buzzword right now. To me, the difference between a digital twin and a regular model is that with the digital twin, we can start that simulation. And as we get new information, we can take that information and we can feed it into our simulation, right? So I take a measurement from the field that says my model thought the corn plants were 5 feet tall, and I go out there and I find out, oh, they're actually 6 feet tall. Well, I can take that 6 foot number, plug it into the model, update the model, and then that kind of keeps my predictions that the model's making in sync with what's actually happening in the field. And then once we have this digital twin, it's like having super insight into what's going on in the field. And so all of the AI methods that we use for everything, from deciding when to send robots out to go harvest, to deciding how much fertilizer to apply, to deciding how to set a contract, what should I sell my corn for if I'm selling it before I've harvested it? And we can use all these different kinds of AI to improve things across the agricultural system.
George, what's the big picture here? What do you think agriculture will look like because of these innovations?
What I hope you see is more variety in food available from domestic sources. I think the people who will really see the benefits are the producers of that food. And that goes all the way from, the owners to the workers who work in those fields. Robots are not going to make the workers go away. The workers will always be there. The workers will do more pleasant tasks. We'll make the robots do the tasks that no one else wants to do.
This seems like a good place to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll talk with George about the innovative work he is leading at CMU's new Robotics Innovation Center.
This podcast is brought to you by Carnegie Mellon University. Located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, CMU is a private, international research university, consistently ranked among the top universities in the world. Its trailblazing research is focused on creating, defining, and accelerating the future of artificial intelligence. For more information, please visit ai.cmu.edu.
Welcome back. You're listening to Where What If Becomes What's Next from Carnegie Mellon University. We're talking with George Kantor, a research professor in the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, who for the past 20 years has pioneered research and development in agricultural robotics. George, let's switch gears and talk about Carnegie Mellon's new Robotics Innovation Center at Hazelwood Green in Pittsburgh. Hazelwood Green is a 178-acre former steel mill site being redeveloped into a sustainable mixed-use hub for innovation, technology, and community. CMU will have a significant research and development presence at the site through its Manufacturing Futures Initiative and the Robotics Innovation Center. George, what is the Robotics Innovation Center, also known as the RIC?
It's essentially a giant robot lab that's going to do all different kinds of things and have facilities for us to test robots in situations that more closely approximate the real world than what we can do in our labs on campus right now. So there will be the thing that's particularly interesting to me working in agriculture is there'll be a large outdoor running room where we can just take the robots outside and do stuff with them. We're going to actually plant some agricultural system yet to be determined, probably a vineyard there, so we can test stuff right there on site. But there'll be places where robots can dig in the ground. There's a big drone cage where drones can fly around. And then inside, there's just lots of big high bay lab space where people will be able to develop robots and do all different kinds of things. One of the things that's really cool that's going to be in there is a big water tank. So our researchers who do underwater robotics, our facilities for that have been somewhat limited. And now we're going to have like a top-notch Cadillac facility for underwater robotics.
I saw on the robotics website that you've developed a swimming robot. Will you be testing it there?
Right. And so what they do right now is they go up and they use the pool that you swim in when it's closed. But it'd be nice to have a real robotic facility.
I understand that the groundbreaking Girls of Steel robotics program is moving soon to the RIC. Tell us more about this innovative initiative.
So the Girls of Steel is a program that we've been running at Carnegie Mellon for the past 15 years. I actually founded it with Patty Rote, who's a local entrepreneurial robotics wheeler dealer in Pittsburgh here. And it started off as an all-girls high school robotics team. And it evolved into this general K through 12 program where we work with kids of, all genders, all ages, to give them hands-on experiences in building robots. It started off as an initiative to specifically get women involved in STEM. And that's still a pretty core part of the mission, but it's really a broad organization. Our programs are all co-ed now. And we are really trying to help out everyone and giving anyone who's interested a venue where they can come out and play with robots.
Sounds like a great and important program. How do they play with and learn about robots?
The most intensive mechanism we use is robotics competitions. So we work with the first robotics competition league, and they have competitions for little kids and high school kids and everything in between. So we compete in those where kids get together, they get a problem, they build a robot, they go somewhere and compete against other robots with it. But we also run summer camps and kind of one-day workshops where kids can come in and get their hands on things. And we're going to use the RIC for those types of activities. We say learn how to build robots, but I think it's really learn how to have fun with robots because, the key to getting the younger kids hooked is to get them to believe that it's fun. And it is fun. And so the best way to get someone to understand how fun it is to have them get in and put their hands on it and play around with them.
You've spent 15 years mentoring K through 12 students, but in the process, have you learned anything from them? Have they given you any ideas you hadn't thought of?
Well, so first of all, I've learned a ton from being involved in that program, mostly on the value of how to be part of a team, how to run a team, how to set goals, the value of communication. The thing that the kids do that is really interesting is that once they get excited, they go off and we live in this world now where there's so much information available through videos and websites. So they'll get excited and they'll go out and they'll find just absolutely crazy things that people are doing on TikTok or whatever. And they'll bring them in and they'll say, hey, can we do this? And there are things that I would have never thought of. Those of us who have expertise, we kind of have a filter, right? And we look at things, we're like, oh, I'd never try that. But when you bring the kids in, they don't have that filter. And so as a result, they find some really, really creative things to try. And a lot of times we'll try them out and they don't work, but a lot of times we'll try them out and they will be successful and they'll wind up on the robot they compete with.
Do you have an example of something like that?
Let me see. What's the craziest one I can think of? There's almost always these robot competitions are set up sort of in a certain way where there's tasks. So there's almost always what I would call a climbing task where the robot, starts on the ground and there's rungs or something that it grabs onto and it climbs up and gets itself off the ground. And so one year there was a task like that. And of course it was meant to be, the designers of the task intended to be, a grappling kind of thing like I just described. One of our kids found a video of a robot jumping and skipping the climbing part and just jumping up to the top of the thing. So we tried to build it and it worked. It was kind of cool. So ideas like that come in, pretty frequently.
Crystal ball time. So what's next for robotics? What's the next big hurdle or game-changing innovation?
Yeah, I really wish I knew the answer to that because I would do it and go all in on it. Again, these large language models are making things possible that were not possible 5 years ago. And I think that we're likely to see more capable robots in households, more capable robots in hospitals, and in the places where we already have very capable robots like Amazon warehouses, for example. We're likely to see even more. So there's not a specific thing. They're going to be everywhere. Now, the tempering thing is the business case, and that's why I'm hesitant to predict, right? Because it's in order to really get out there and get in lots of people's hands, there has to be a business around it, and someone has to do the non-technical things that people like me aren't necessarily very good at. But robots are becoming so capable that they can do lots of different things. It's just a matter of how you get them out there into people's hands.
You're developing robotic innovations around perception, movement, and dexterity. So what's next?
The crux right now is interaction, right? We're pretty good at getting around. We're pretty good at seeing things. We're pretty good at mechanisms that can go to a particular place. What we're not so good is in it is predicting what's going to happen. When I pick up that cup full of water, is the water going to slosh around and spill out? When I reach to push a branch out of the way on a tree, am I going to break that branch off, or is it just going to gently bend out of the way? So those are the things we're working on now, but there's a lot of great capability. We're making a lot of progress.
Well, that concludes our episode. Thank you to our guest, Professor George Kantor, and thanks to you for listening. Please check the show notes where you'll find links to additional resources for this episode. And to learn more or contact us with a story, idea, or comments, please visit cmu.edu/whatsnextpodcast. If you're enjoying this show, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast site and share with friends. Oh, and be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. I'm Randy Scott, and you've been listening to Where What If Becomes What's Next from Carnegie Mellon University, where we are asking the bold questions that become innovations for the betterment of humanity. Stay tuned and stay curious.